Turner.
Thank you. Thank you. Gee, it's been a while since I've stood in front of a big class like this because I retired in 2017. But it's really, really nice to be here with all of you, and I'm really excited to be here. See all your smiling faces. So first of all, I want to recognize that we are within the ancestral lands of some of the Coast Salish peoples who share the lands also on Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands in Canada. But the Lummi and the Nooksack peoples who have lived in this area for thousands of years and cared for the lands and waters. And all of you, the people who have helped to organize my visit. I've had some really nice times with some of you already. Nice dinner last night and a nice outing today. So thanks all of you for making me feel so welcome. And I also like to thank my husband Bob and a lot of other friends and colleagues who have supported my work. I guess everyone recognizes Abe Lloyd. But there he is in the field. And especially also want to share my appreciation with all of my teachers, the people who have over 50 years now have been teaching me and sharing their knowledge with me. And these are just a few of them that represent so many others who I feel very close to. Many of them have passed away now, but they're still very much with me. Whenever I go on a trip like this, they're with me. So Florence Davidson, here I'm pointing at the screen, that doesn't help you. Florence Davidson of Mass at Haida Gwaii. And the bottom here, Ida Jones from the Pacheedaht Nation. Dr. Richard Atleo, a dear friend who I'm going to have lunch with next Saturday. Helen Clifton from Hartley Bay, she's in her mid-90s now. I've worked with her since 2000. And Quaxi Stalawatla, Clan Chief Adam Dick, who Abe knows well and we've worked with for many years. And my friend Joan Morris Sachlama, who was born and raised at Tlaches, a place where Marco was not long ago. So these are just a few of the people I'll be talking about and sharing their knowledge with you. So we're talking here about change and people's knowledge about environmental change and climate change. So one time I was talking to Helen on the phone and she said people are saying they're seeing robins. This was February 5th. They don't even know what to do with this weather. It was so different from what they'd experienced before. And she talked about in May 2001, when I was talking to her on the phone, she said, there's a strange bird. We've never seen it before. It must be a nach-nach bird. That nach is like spirit, a spirit bird. And it's got a yellow head. And right away, I figured out it's got to be a yellow-headed blackbird. There aren't that many birds that have yellow heads like that. And sure enough, I was up there at her house and looked out at her cherry tree, and there was the nach-nach bird, the yellow-headed blackbird that they had never seen before in the village at Hartley Bay, which is opposite, on the mainland opposite Haida Gwaii. And some of you might know Douglas Channel and Kitimat, which is at the far end of inland of Douglas Channel. Hartley Bay is out on the coastal side of Douglas Channel on the north side. And Helen and I actually wrote a paper together called It's So Different Today about her observations of climate change that was published in the journal Global Environmental Change. And this is another quote from her. Back in the days when there was an Indian summer, they could dry the fish easily. Nowadays the fish gets rancid and moldy or full of bugs because there's so much rain. It's so different today. So Helen was the one, more than any of the others, who was really always talking about how things had changed so much. And she's the one who got me started in thinking about about climate change and the impact that it is having on people's cultures and livelihoods. So I'll just give you a quick introduction about the region and the people, talk about environmental knowledge systems, a little bit about environmental change, how we need to be, all of us, incorporating knowledge from Indigenous peoples who are there in situ, out on the land, observing every day, every month, every year, what's happening out there and recognizing these changes. There's so much we have to learn from them. And then talk a little bit about the importance of biocultural diversity. So I told Helen when I was in Victoria that we had a late snow. It was in late March or April, and she said, that's what we call herring weather, when you have a late snow like that. When it usually comes, it stays for a few hours and then it melts, and that's the time when the herring are ready to spawn. So there's all this knowledge that goes along with different kinds of weather and climate. So I'm talking about the peoples who are sometimes called the Northwest Coast First Nations, who've occupied the coastal areas from Alaska down to, well, the lower area of that cultural group sometimes is put about northern Oregon. So more or less the group of the peoples who have occupied the coastal area west of the Coast Mountains, but I'll be talking a little bit about east of the Coast Mountains as well. And they arrived here at least 14,000. Now they think at least 15,000 and maybe much longer arrived on this coast. From the scientist's point of view, arriving from across the Aleutians and from northeastern Asia, from First Nations like Quaxustalawatla, we've been here since the beginning of time. That's what he says. We've been here since the beginning of time. And these people are very adept at using the resources of the ocean, the shore, and the adjacent land areas right up to the mountaintops for their well-being and survival. Resilient, resourceful people who know how to live well in this environment, even through severe winters and through all kinds of changing environments. They've always shared, they've always incorporated new technologies in their cultures and adapted them to their own needs. And they're as vibrant and active today as they ever have been. That photo of Virginia Tom in the top corner was taken by Edward Curtis. And Virginia Tom was the mother of Alice Paul, who I worked with at Heshquiet in the 1980s. And Edward Curtis, for whatever reason, he didn't usually put the names of the people in his photographs. So whenever I show that photograph, I always make sure that they know that this is Virginia Tom, Alice Paul's mother. And she's down on the beach near Heshquiet with a beautiful packed basket of split cedar root and a cedar bark cape and skirt. So there's sort of what I was talking about on a map. And I put an arrow so you could see where Helen lives at Hartley Bay. And I talked to her not long on the phone. She's pretty amazing. She's really with it and still very interested in everything that's going on. But you can see the diversity of peoples and cultures by the lines that sort of delineate the language. Different language groups. There are about 19 distinct Indigenous languages and major dialects spoken along the coast. And as I mentioned, marine ecosystems are really, really important for people's livelihoods and well-being. and they're always featured in stories and ceremonies and in all kinds of ways. There's Helen again teaching her granddaughter how to cut halibut, and I learned how to cut halibut from her, and believe me, it's not easy. It takes a lot of skill and knowledge to do these things that we kind of take for granted. But this is her territory up there, the Steller sea lion, the humpback whales, and seabirds galore, the sea urchins and the kelp. All of these things have great meaning to these people and to all the peoples of the coast. But also important, equally important, are the forests and the inland ecosystems, because you can't really access all those resources out there on the coast if you don't have the tools and the wherewithal from the resources of the forest. So think about the dugout canoes that people need to get around on the ocean and up the rivers, and think about the fishing gear that people need, fish nets and harpoons and so forth. All of these things come from the forest and from the land. And also a lot of people's food comes from the land, even though we think of them as living largely on seafood and salmon. But people also need a lot of other food that comes from terrestrial ecosystems. And there's my Haida sister, Keeljuice, Barb Wilson, at her home at Skidegate. And people have not just been sort of complacent occupiers of the land and users of all of the resources. They've been active in maintaining, sustaining, and enhancing the resources that they've used. And most of us recognize now the use of fire, for example. People burned over prairies. Burning has been banned in many areas, so there's not too many people today who know how to do it properly. But some of the elders that I've worked with remember or were told about that fire. Think how old Smokey the Bear is, and that's about how long fires have been suppressed in this area. And there have been a few experimental burns to try to recover some of the knowledge and some of the conditions that promote the growth of the prairie ecosystems. And some of these have been quite remarkable in that species will appear that they hadn't seen there for a long, long time. There was a burn that Peter Dunwoody did on one of the small islands in the San Juan group. Yellow Island, thank you. Yeah, and they learned a lot from that. And more of the First Nations in Canada, Indigenous people, Native Americans, are doing experimental burns here and there and starting to relearn some of the knowledge that was lost when burning was banned. But the Europeans who arrived in Victoria, for example, they saw this beautiful savanna landscape with big oak trees and camas meadows, and they just thought it was the most beautiful, picturesque landscape, and they chose it to build Fort Victoria there because of this beauty that they saw, never recognizing that it was people there who created that beauty. And so all of these ecosystems, whether they're the marine ones or whether they're the forest ecosystems or the wetlands or any of the other areas that people have used and occupied, are all vulnerable to climate change. And we can see it happening. There's been studies showing that yellow cedar is disappearing in places in Alaska. And if we drive up Vancouver Island, up the Island Highway, you can see hundreds of dead cedar trees. And some places on the coast you can see salal that's just brown and dead from some kind of a fungus infection, but probably triggered by climate change. And I put this picture in here of a fan palm. This is in Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, a fan palm growing next to a western red cedar tree. It seems a bit incongruous, but that's kind of the way things are now. We've managed to mix things up so much, bringing new species in and putting them together in new combinations. My friend Eric Higgs co-authored a book called Novel Ecosystems, because we've created ecosystems that have never existed before on the planet, and we'll never be able to get rid of them, even if we wanted to. There's no way we can put everything back in Pandora's box, so we have to work with what we've got in terms of species and combinations and try and make the best of it. So we'll go on. My friend Fikret Berkus gave a very nice, succinct definition of Indigenous or traditional ecological knowledge. I sometimes say traditional ecological knowledge and wisdom, because it incorporates not just facts, but also ability to make decisions and to think about things holistically. But this is his definition: a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief, evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission. And this is one of my all-time favorite pictures that I've ever taken, photos, of Helen with her little granddaughter Janelle. And she's teaching Janelle, but Janelle doesn't even know she's being taught. They're pounding halibut walks, which is dried halibut. And Helen has a yew-wood mallet and a yew-wood slab. And Janelle has her own little mallet and her own little slab, and she's just having fun with her grandma. But she's learning at the same time, and that's a very important way of learning, by cultural transmission. That's one of the key ways that people learned. There's Quaxistala Wathla again, our dear friend, Clan Chief Adam Dick, who taught me a great deal over the years and taught Abe and many of our other students as well, other colleagues like some of you know Dr. Doug Duer, who's worked with Adam as well. So if you think about that, what Fikret's definition was about traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, there are different components to it. There's the practical knowledge about species, about what's good to eat and what isn't, and how do you harvest it, where do you harvest it, when do you harvest it, what does it eat. All of this knowledge that you need to know, but you also need to know a lot more. You have to be able to pass that knowledge along in effective ways, to teach your kids, to teach other people, and that's done through what I showed you with Helen, for experiential learning, but also through stories and ceremonies and language, words, phrases that people use, convey knowledge and teaching with them. There's also ways of making decisions and planning. The governance of that knowledge is an important component of it. The leadership, the way people have proprietorship over certain areas, the way people prescribe monitoring over generations. All of that is part of the knowledge system. And then, of course, the underlying worldview or belief system that is generally one that's quite different from mainstream society, I would say. Because in the Indigenous knowledge systems that I'm familiar with, people consider all beings are relatives, not just other human beings, but all beings. So animals, trees, fish, and that notion, my friend Dennis Martinez and Enrique Salmon both have called that kin-centricity, the belief that everything is our kin. And if you think of it that way, then you think of your kin, where they live, what they need. You wouldn't go out and, go to your grandma's house and trash your living room. And you shouldn't do that to your tree kin either. You shouldn't go and trash the places where they live and trash the things that they need. And so it gives you a much more caring perspective about things, a more thoughtful, respectful relationship with the other species. And that's reflected again in the stories and in the ceremonies that people have, like the first salmon ceremony, for example. So, in terms of climate and predictability, people require some semblance of order in terms of where they go, what they harvest, what they can expect to get, what foods grow where, and how to harvest them. And they need some predictable levels of rain, water, snow, and so forth. And that's what Helen was talking about when she said it's so different today. She wasn't able to predict, as her ancestors, as she had done for her whole life until about the turn of the century, 2000. She wasn't able to assume that the seaweed was going to be ready when they thought it would be ready, that the berries were going to be there and ripe when they thought they would be, or that the salmon were going to come up the river at the time that they always did. So everything was changing at that time, and it still is changing. There is this, predictable pattern that's called often the seasonal round, where people go to certain places at certain times of year to get certain resources and to process them, put them aside and store them, use them for trade, use them for feasting, use them for day-to-day living. And they have to know all of this, but it's all done in this distributed movement around people's homelands and ending up usually in the winter village, staying put for a few months before they start out again on the next seasonal round to get the herring eggs and the seaweed and so forth. And there are certain indicators for the timing, like the herring weather, the herring snow that I talked about, or the blooming of the salmonberry blossom. That's not to say that people haven't experienced lots of changes, and those are embedded in their stories as well. All kinds of things. Sea level has changed up and down the coast. Earthquakes, tsunamis. There's stories about these floods. There's the flood story. Not to embarrass Marco, but he said arbutus is your favorite tree. And there's a flood story for that, with the Saanich on southern Vancouver Island endured the flood. They were told that the flood was coming. They made their canoes and they made long cedar ropes and they anchored them at the top of Llawelnoch, the mountain, Mount Newton, onto arbutus trees, because arbutus trees anchor themselves into the rock. And when the flood came, their canoes rose up and they floated on the surface for days and days, and then finally they settled again on the top of Llawelnoch. And so from that day on, they don't burn arbutus because they respect it and they show appreciation for having saved them during the Great Flood. So that's just one of many flood stories, and there are many of them up and down the coast. Stories of droughts and other kinds of times of resource scarcity where, for one reason or another, the salmon didn't come up the river. And then they have knowledge that's like the fallback knowledge, things that you can rely on. Up in the interior, if the salmon or the deer didn't come, people would fall back, especially on the green vegetables, the cactus. You can always find cactus under the snow, or the hakwa, or the cow parsnip shoots will come up and you can eat those. You know where root vegetables are and you can go and dig them. So there's always something, the knowledge incorporates ways of dealing with unexpected change, to some extent anyway. And part of Indigenous knowledge is incorporating this direct observation and insights that are then embedded within the stories and ceremonies of people. All of these different elements. And the social systems help people to balance their use of the resources as well, to have leadership, to have people that you can turn to, elders who are knowledgeable, who can give you advice when something unexpected happens. That's all part of the knowledge system. There's one story that I've been told by a number of elders from the Nisga'a Nation up in the Nass Valley in northern BC about some boys who were misbehaving terribly. They were torturing the salmon coming up the river by cutting their backs open and putting pitch in the cut and lighting it on fire, and then laughing while the salmon went up the creek and they could see their burning backs in the dark. And shortly after that, what happened was there was a huge volcanic eruption, and the mountain beside overflowed with lava, and it filled the valley with lava. It buried the village and another village besides. And that story is always told to children so that they learn to really respect the food that they harvest and they need. So these are lessons and adaptations all at the same time. There's the story of the Great Flood. I'd forgotten that I actually had it in this slideshow, but that was from Chief Philip Paul from Tsartlip, Saanich. And there's the top of Llawelnoch. And that's the story about Arbutus. There it is. They attached their canoes to Llawelnoch, Mount Newton. Many people were drowned, but those who anchored their canoes to the arbutus tree were the ones who were saved. Helen's people, the Gitga'at Nation people, have their own story about a time when a young man, there was one of those late snows, like the herring snow. And this young man, they were out camping, getting salmon, and he sort of shook his fist at the snow and started yelling at it because he was mad that it was snowing. And the snow just kept coming and coming. And finally, the whole village was covered with snow, and the spring just wasn't coming. And one day, they saw a robin fly by with a salmonberry blossom in its beak. And then they knew that somewhere outside of where they were, it was really spring. And so they left that village and they found another place to live. And the salmonberry blossom and the robin were what told them where to go. But there again, this young boy was disrespectful to the weather and to the environment, and they were all punished because of that. So that's a lesson that children are taught even today. You don't curse at the weather. You treat it with respect. And then, see if I can get this to go. Maybe not. No, maybe not. Well, I'll have to give you my own rendition of the the salmonberry bird. The Swainson's thrush has a beautiful fluty, risey song. Yeah, who did that? That's great. Something like that. And in the Saanich, Sanchathan language, it's calling to the salmonberry bushes, the ones with the different colors of berries, because there are bushes that have dark berries and bushes that have light golden berries and bushes in between. And he's calling to them and saying, come on, all you little dark ones. Come on, all you little white ones. Come on, all you little red ones. Come on, all you little blonde ones. Ripen, 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 ripen. Huelesh, huelesh. And this is a way of, again, one of those phenological indicators, I guess, the singing of the Swainson's thrush, but it's embodied in the song of the bird itself. And children will hear that, and there's stories that go along with it. I doubt if I have time to tell you, but maybe later. So there's this whole body of knowledge in Indigenous knowledge systems called traditional phenological knowledge, where you use the life cycles and stages of one species to determine stages of another species. And my friend Trevor Lance and I did a paper on this many years back now. And we found that most of the phenological knowledge about plants pertain to the life cycle of plants, life stage of plants that determined the life cycles of fish and clams and things like that. Because, if you're living up above the Fraser River and the Fraser's way down in the canyon, you don't want to be climbing down there every day to see whether the salmon's coming up. So instead, they have this little buttercup called the spring salmoni buttercup, and it has a flower that's the color of the eye of the first spring salmon to come up the river, the Fraser River, in about February, and it blooms right then in the sagebrush. It's called the sagebrush buttercup. And so when the sagebrush buttercup blooms, that it's time to go down and fish for the first run of the salmon coming up the river, the spring salmon. Then later on, there's the first run of sockeye in June. The sockeye have a pink stripe along them that's the same color as the flower, the wild rose flower. And so that's another indicator. When the wild roses are blooming, that's the time that you go down to get those salmon. And so on. There's all kinds. When the ocean spray's blooming, it's time to get certain clams for some of the people, or seals. And I'll tell you about the stinging nettle. Helen Clifton told me this one. In their seaweed camp at Kiel on Princess Royal Island, they have stinging nettle growing around the buildings. And she says that grows at the same rate at the same time as the seaweed. So when the stinging nettle's about this high, the seaweed's about that high, and then it's ready to be picked. So they don't have to go all the way over to Campania Island to see whether the seaweed's ready to pick. They just look at the nettle and they can tell. There are all kinds of weather-related taboos. For example, you're not supposed to pick seaweed in the rain. That's one, which I unfortunately broke one time, and for that reason, I was never able to pick seaweed because it was always raining. And after a while, after I went to the seaweed camp several times, everyone would say, "Oh no, Nancy's coming to the seaweed camp, it's gonna rain." And it did. My daughter Kate got to pick seaweed before I got to pick seaweed. But one time I did, finally. It was sunny. I got out there on the rock. I was in my glory picking seaweed. And then I heard, whoosh, and this great big whale just came up beside me and just hung out there in the little bay where I was picking seaweed. And I just had the most glorious day ever. Sorry, I got carried away there, but there's flowers that you're not supposed to pick. The paintbrush is called the thunder flower in the Ogacho carrier, and if you pick it, you'll have a thunderstorm. The red columbine and the blue harebell are called the red and blue rainflowers, Dal Hill in Haida. And if you pick them, they bloom at the time that the seaweed's ready. And if you pick those flowers, you won't be able to dry your seaweed because it's going to rain. So there are lots of other taboos about weather, about pointing at mountains and so forth, that you will cause storms and bad weather. And here's one that my book, The Earth's Blanket, is derived from this notation in James Tate's book. Flowers, plants, and grass, especially the latter, are the covering or blanket of the earth. If too much plucked or ruthlessly destroyed, earth is sorry and weeps. It rains or is angry and makes rain, fog, and bad weather. So this, again, is a way of teaching people about looking after the land. Don't destroy things ruthlessly. You look after the places that you live and the things that you need. And there we are, the tla'ask. You never pick that seaweed in the rain. And if you do, it's going to rain for a long time. Also, there's other taboos. You're not supposed to pick cedar bark before you pick your seaweed because it will cause rain. And I wondered about that, and I asked a tree physiologist once about that. And I know when you peel off a piece of cedar bark, you get a scent, a whole aerosol display of different compounds that you can smell. And I asked a friend about that. Could those serve as little nuclei for fog or rain? And he said yes. If the air is saturated and if you get those little droplets in the air, that they could serve as a point of condensation and actually start rain. So there's a lot of knowledge and wisdom embedded in these taboos. The month of May is called Tla'ask, the month to gather seaweed. But as Helen says, April showers don't bring May flowers anymore. We get too much rain. And just to show you the importance of the seaweed and how knowledge has been shared up and down the coast, if you look at the names for seaweed from Alaska down to here in the Puget Sound, the names are similar, they're related. They have the same common origin. They were traded, exchanged, and developed over time. Tla'ask, Tlakas, Slakas, Tlakst, and Tlakistan. Tlakistan is Kwakwala, yeah. So there we are. There's the May harvest camp when people are using seaweed to trade for oolakan grease. They're harvesting rockfish. They're getting oolakans, smoked oolakans and halibut. And seaweed, oh, there it is. I've already told you about how the stinging nettle is an indicator for how the seaweed grows. And that's Helen's words there. They grow about the same time, they're about the same length. And so people go out when the nettles are ready, are the right size, and the sun is right, and they harvest the seaweed and process it by drying it in the sun. And they spread it out on the rocks, or they spread it onto cedar board trays, and they dry it like that. And then when they get it back home, there's a whole nother process that goes on where you spray a certain kind of salt water on the seaweed and you press it into cedar wood boxes and you put cedar boughs in between the layers and you press it down and you leave it for about 3 days to get its flavor. And then you take it out and you chop it up in blocks, and then you spread it out to dry again. And that's the best seaweed of all. That's what, the really creme de la creme of the seaweed. And so what happens, you have to go out when there's a spring tide in May, the lowest tides. Early in the morning, you pick seaweed all morning. You bring it back, you put it out to dry in the sun at noon. At 3 o'clock, you turn it over. And then at 6 o'clock, when the sun is going down, you bring it in. That's the pattern, that's the rhythm that people have been doing for generations. And there we are. You're not allowed to pick seaweed in the rain. It's dangerous, but also it doesn't taste the same and you can't dry it the same. And so people are experiencing this strange weather. The seaweed is freezing and it doesn't taste good. Because the weather has changed so much, it's hard to say what's happening to the natural growth. And Jalan Edenshaw, who was formerly one of my students, but is from Masset, and he learned from one of the elders there, who said that seaweed is ripening is ready to pick much earlier than it used to be. 2 or 3 weeks earlier, and this was in 2005. So people have to adapt. And they do this by drying their seaweed, just waiting until there's a few hours of sunshine so they can pick it. And then they put it in the freezer. It means they have to bring a generator down to the seaweed camp and a freezer, freeze their seaweed, and then bring it back and put it out to dry sometime in the summer when there's sun. And it doesn't often happen. There's Helen drying her seaweed on an overweighty cardboard boxes on the village planks because she couldn't dry it as she usually would on the rocks. And the fish, there's my daughter Kate, who got to pick seaweed before I did. But now they have to dry their fish inside a lot of the time. They can't dry it outside because the weather's too unpredictable. The same with the herring spawn on kelp. There's my friend Barb again. They often have to dry their herring eggs on kelp indoors because they can't get enough sunny weather now when they harvest the kelp cow. The same changes are noted in other places too. Adam was talking about tsatsayam, the eelgrass, and how a lot of it isn't as good as it used to be. They want really nice fleshy orange rhizomes to eat, and then they take the thin strip of leaves, I've got to stop soon, and wrap it around and make a little bundle and dip it in ulican grease and eat it. It's really sweet and really crunchy and delicious. And of course, everyone here knows how important eelgrass is as a habitat. But nowadays, the rhizomes are often just black. They're just not as fleshy or as good as in some places as they used to be. There's concerns about pollution, but also about the climate. Berries, the same. They're not as productive, people say. There's Cecilia, Belinda Claxton, my berry picking buddy. And Helen, one year I taught to her, everything's different. No salal, no pigeonberries, that's Cornus canadensis. Thimbleberries, crab apples, high bush cranberries, or wild currants, just none. And I've talked to elders in a lot of different places who say that the berry production is very unpredictable, more than before, and often much lower. Helen thought maybe it was the unseasonable spring rains that meant the pollinators, the flowers and the pollinators weren't in sync. And the bees couldn't pollinate the berry bushes, so the berries didn't produce, which is a pretty interesting idea, but need to be tested, of course. But we have a lot of cases where the berry bushes are suffering from dry weather or from disease that's from dry weather. So one adaptation might be to grow your berry bushes near to waterfalls, which is what people often did to create a continuous source of moisture for your berry bushes. So we know that climate change and environmental change is real. Some of us know that. But there are also all kinds of other challenges that we have. And we've cut down too much of our forests. We have beetle infestations and so forth. Our fisheries are suffering. There are major forest fires. And so Indigenous knowledge and the knowledge that people have to share with us in facing and adapting to these changes is very important. Providing direct knowledge and information, helping to develop models of how we can accommodate and adapt. Formulating hypotheses, ideas like the pollinator idea about what we can do research on and test, and providing alternative pathways and approaches to sustainable living, what we value in this life that doesn't have to be so consumptive. There's Jalan's dad, Gujau, now Gdansta, Chief Gdansta. we would be, any destruction that occurs to the soil, water, earth, or air of Haida Gwaii degrades at the very being of what a Haida is. So they're very, very aware of what's happening, and they're committed to looking after their lands and waters. And the idea of seventh generational thinking, I think our politicians need to learn that more. They think about 4-year terms, I think, a lot of the time, maybe 8-year terms, but we need to think 7 generations ahead if we really want to make a difference and make policies and plans that are going to change things. And sharing of knowledge of all kinds increases people's adaptive capacity and resilience. So we need participation from everybody as partners in what we can do to conserve the beautiful places that we all share. Not just for ourselves, but for all the beings and future generations. And that's where this idea of biocultural diversity comes in. It's not just biological diversity, but we need a diversity of cultural knowledge, a diversity of languages, a diversity of perspectives from our human relatives that goes with biological diversity, to think about how we can survive as humans and as beings and share this planet with all of the other beings as well. Indigenous knowledge and perspectives and the needs of Indigenous peoples matter significantly in our considerations of what climate change is, its impact, and ways to adapt to and remediate its effects. And we've only just begun what must surely be a critically important journey of research and learning. Aichka, thank you very much.
Maybe time for a couple of quick questions.
Don't be shy. You don't have to ask a question. If you just want to say something, go for it.
Were you always a plant person as a child?
Was I always a plant person?
Or a person?
I was a plant person from the time I was 3 at least, maybe before that. But I was born in Berkeley, but we moved to Missoula, Montana when I was a baby. And we lived there until I was 5. And those 5 years that I remember well were spent, my sister and I, rambling around through the ponderosa pines and aspens and picking wild strawberries and choke cherries and what we call sarvis berries. Now I call them Saskatoon berries, being from Canada. But yeah, so I remember all those plants from that time. And then when we moved to Victoria, when I was 5, I was already hooked. I knew I wanted to study plants when I was, very young, 8 or 9 years old. Yeah. Yes?
So many of the cultural taboos you presented revolve around respect for your relatives. And
Yeah.
much of the dominant culture that we live in does the opposite. And I'm wondering what some of the people you work with think of how our culture disrespects their relatives.
Yeah, the question was the examples that I gave all around respect and how important respect is, and what to my teachers in the Indigenous communities, what do they think about how disrespectful society at large is with the way we deal, not just with each other, but with the trees and the salmon and everything else. And they're horrified, especially the elders who have grown up with the traditional teachings. They're just horrified to think that you would treat species that way. Everyone recognizes we have to eat, we need to use trees, we need to catch salmon and use other plants and animals as food. but we have also, it has to be reciprocal. To me, it's not just nature's services to humans, but what are humans' services to nature? How can we help sustain and look after them and respect them, as you say? And that's the kind of thing that the elders will teach children, and hopefully all of us will learn from it. Thank you.
Maybe one more?
Yes.
Thank you, Nancy. I really appreciate your presentation and your work in general. I'm really interested in the idea of environmental hope in the face of climate change and all of these challenges. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about what you've seen in these communities and their response to climate change that gives you hope.
Okay. Environmental hope is so important. And we often go into despair. There's something called ecological grief that many people experience, and myself included at times, when you see things happening that you can't do anything about and you know it's bad for the planet. But at the same time, just go out under the stars at night and just look up and just think, oh my gosh, we're just this tiny little speck, and here we are, we're all alive under these stars at this time. Isn't it amazing? And then you think about all the trees and all the other people and how much beauty there is. Everywhere you look, there's beauty, and you just have to learn to see it and to focus on that and realize that we're all members of the same team. We're all working to the same ends. I think everyone here, we all have the same aspirations. We want the planet to be a beautiful place for our children, grandchildren on into the future. And so we're all working as best we can together, and I think that's really important. I just got an email from a young man who's one of our students, who was just, he had attended the Pender Island conference that you were at, and he was just feeling so disheartened. And I wrote him an email today and said, I'm going to give you a lecture. You smarten up. There's lots of good things happening, and you're part of it, and you're doing your bit. And don't ever think that you can't make a change, or you can't have that you can't make a difference in the world. And work towards that, and take pleasure in everything that you accomplish towards that goal, I think. And never apologize for who you are. You're who you are. That's it. And all of us are who we are, and we're all working together. And I think that's really beautiful. So thank you for that question.
Okay.
Thanks.